everybody. Happy New Year. So I am live right now on both TikTok and YouTube. So sorry if I'm looking in different directions, but I'm going to be answering any questions that people have about the AP Lang exam. So one of my goals in 2023 is to help as many teachers and students as possible prepare for the AP Lang exam. And so one way I thought I could do this was to go live each week on TikTok and also on YouTube to answer questions. So each week we'll have sort of like a general topic, but I'm happy to answer questions that people have about the exam in general. So if you are just joining us, then feel free to ask a question in the chat. And also, if you're not subscribed, please do so because I am super close to 10K on both platforms, both on YouTube and TikTok. So I would love it if you are able to subscribe. If you would do so, I would love that support. So let's start talking about the AP Lang exam because I know that it's a few months away, but I know that students have a lot of questions. So if you have a question about the exam, feel free to leave it in the comments and also be sure to hit that like button so that way I know that you are enjoying the chat. I wanted to start by talking about some of the most common mistakes that I see students make at this point in the year for AP Lang, because I think that if students are able to avoid making these mistakes, it could potentially help their score. So let's start with the essays in general. Some of the biggest mistakes that we see for AP Lang essays would be a lack of commentary. Commentary is kind of like, in my opinion, the thing that like makes or breaks your essays. So I wanted to give a couple basic tips for commentary, and these go for all three FRQs. So synthesis, rhetorical analysis, argument. One thing you want to make sure that you're not doing is you don't want to just summarize your evidence. So if you have a quote, the commentary is supposed to analyze that evidence. It's supposed to tell us like why, how, or so what. So if the commentary just basically says what the quote says, then it's very limited and simplistic. So make sure that you're asking yourself why or how or so what. A really quick tip for your commentary in any of your AP Lang essays is to use the word because. It sounds really simple, but it's a way for you to expand your thoughts, and that's going to help you add more commentary as well. Now, you might be wondering, how much commentary do I need? And this is kind of a tricky question, but you want at least like 2 sentences of commentary, in my opinion. I've seen as many as 4. I feel like the students who can do 4 sentences of commentary, though, it sometimes gets repetitive and like, so don't feel like you have to do that much, but you want to make sure that you have more commentary than evidence. So if you're just joining us either on YouTube or TikTok, please feel free to ask questions. Right now, I'm just talking about AP Lang commentary, but I'm happy to answer specific questions that you have. And feel free to hit that like button. I'm going to be going live weekly between now and the AP Lang exam to help students. All right, so back to talking about commentary. That's the thing that I think makes or breaks your essays. And so we want to make sure that we're using verbs that can help us as well. So I have a whole list in my classroom for my students to use, like on our wall. But some of the ones they use most frequently are, let's see, highlights, illustrates, demonstrates, reveals. So those are all synonyms for shows. A lot of times the lower essays that we see, they only use the verb shows. And like there's nothing wrong with that word, but if you could use a synonym, that would help. It will vary your word choice and it will push you to add some commentary as well. All right, so something else about commentary specifically for rhetorical analysis, I just posted a YouTube video about this where I broke down the AP Lang rubric for rhetorical analysis. Something else that really helps improve your score for that is connecting the rhetorical choice that you're talking about to the message, argument, or purpose, because they're going to ask you about that in the prompt. So you want to make sure that you're not ignoring that. So you really want to talk about how that choice helps them convey their message, argument, or purpose. And if you're a little confused about the difference between them, because they are kind of similar, purpose is why the writer is giving the speech or writing the letter. Maybe it's an article. So the purpose is the why. So the purpose could be like to inspire, to entertain, to inform. But the message is more like the takeaway. So, more like the lesson that the audience is supposed to have because of listening to this or reading this. So, they are sort of related. If the prompt asks you about the message, it's okay to talk about purpose as well. And you don't even need to use the word purpose. You can just say, like, so and so does this in order to, and then you would say why. Or you can even put that at the beginning of your sentence. In order to inspire the audience, the author does this. You'd want to actually use the author's name though. So really make sure that you're not ignoring that part of the prompt because that's what is going to help your score. If you're trying to get a 3 or even a 4 in your evidence and commentary, you have to make sure that you're connecting the choices that you're talking about to the message, argument, or purpose. And argument is usually to persuade. So usually if there's a message, there's not necessarily an argument. All passages should have a purpose. All right, awesome. So if you're just joining us over on TikTok or YouTube, I'm just chatting about AP Lang exam questions in general. So feel free to ask a question and please make sure you hit your screen to give it some likes as well if you're on TikTok. So for the AP Lang exam, I think one of the biggest things that students might not realize about the exam in general is that you can still score well and your essay doesn't have to be perfect. So you can have spelling mistakes, you can have grammar mistakes. Honestly, your body paragraphs, one can be super strong and the other one could be like really close and you could still score well because sometimes that really strong paragraph elevates your score. So for my students that struggle with pacing, usually they only write 2 body paragraphs. I think for a lot of students, 3 body paragraphs and doing it well can be really hard. So if you are a student who is stressing about the number of body paragraphs, I would say 2 is fine. But really make sure that you're elevating your commentary and making sure that at least one of those body paragraphs is really thorough and really strong, because that's going to potentially help your score. Because if you look at the rubric, in many cases, you can see that even getting a 3 out of 4 in evidence and commentary, you're allowed a little bit of inconsistency. It just has to be achieving like the goal of the prompt, like the goal of the task. So it doesn't have to be perfect to still score well, which I think is important. Happy New Year! Yes. I've been told to do 2 for syllogistic method. So 2 body paragraphs. If so, yeah, that makes sense. Honestly, the students who write 3 body paragraphs, I feel like a lot of times what I've seen, and this is just a generalization, it's not like everything that I've seen, but a lot of the ones that have 3 body paragraphs, they have, it's almost like all 3 body paragraphs are like close and or like I don't want to say mediocre in a bad way, but when students sometimes push themselves for quantity of paragraphs instead of quality, it's almost like as I'm reading their essay, I'm like, I just wish you would have spent more time on these like 2 body paragraphs and instead of having that third. But I have seen some students write 3 body paragraphs very well. I think it just kind of depends on a few factors. One would be the prompt because not all prompts are easy to write 3 body paragraphs for. And then also the student, because I have some students who totally can do it, no problem. And I have other students who, if I ask them to write 3 body paragraphs, they would get super stressed out. They like to do 2. So there's nothing wrong with 2 body paragraphs. You also don't need a conclusion. It's good to have one, especially if you can do it well. But a lot of students sometimes freak out about the pacing and they're like, oh, I didn't get to my conclusion. There's nothing on the rubric that says that you need one. So, especially at this point in the year, because it's January, a lot of students are still just trying to learn. You don't necessarily need a conclusion to score well. I've read a lot of essays where like the last body paragraph just kind of wrapped up the essay and it read just fine. In fact, a lot of times students write conclusions that are really simplistic and it's just kind of like a 1-sentence recap of their whole essay. And those as a teacher are sometimes kind of frustrating because I'm like, I like your essay didn't take me that long to read. It was like 4 paragraphs tops. So you don't necessarily need to recap. But if you're worried that your thesis wasn't defensible, that could be a good place to put it is have it in your intro and then like kind of reword it in your conclusion. I have seen some essays where that's been valuable. But if you're writing a conclusion, instead of just recapping all your main points that you just said, it's usually better to kind of like zoom out and think about the issue in a broader context instead. All right, let's see. Do you have any tips for finding quotes for a synthesis essay? I feel like it can be hard for looking for the right quotes. Yes. Okay. So here's kind of how I approach synthesis. Um, First of all, when you read the topic that you're talking about, a lot of teachers tell students to kind of like create a tentative thesis. And I think for some prompts, this is fine. But for other prompts, if you're not familiar with the topic, you can go straight to the sources. So you want to, as you're reading, you want to be, especially if you're not sure what you want to say, you want to be looking at the arguments within the sources and thinking about, okay, like what are they saying and do I agree with them? It helps to make some kind of like T chart or table to kind of figure out, okay, these sources are talking about this issue, or these ones are for it or against it. So there's different ways to organize your notes. But as far as like finding quotes, one tip, and this goes for rhetorical analysis too, but definitely synthesis, is you don't want long quotes. That's one of the things that I think students sometimes misunderstand is they think that because they need specific evidence, they should just put these long quotes in and somehow that's going to like carry their essay. But in actuality, you want shorter quotes. So I tell my students to look for almost like fragments. I've heard some teachers say like no more than 8 words, no more than 5 words. I try not to put too many rules on it, but I do understand why they would suggest that. And it's simply because if you can take like a short quote that's almost like a fragment or not a complete thought, it's easier to embed it into a sentence of your own. So, things that I would look for as you are approaching synthesis would be facts and statistics, because that's going to be logical, concrete data. So, anytime you see like percentages or ratios or just concrete data, especially if you think it's going to help your argument, I would note that. And that could come in an article or sometimes those visual texts like charts and graphs and stuff like that. Because remember, you're making an argument. So if you make a logical argument with like facts and statistics and everything, then it's going to help. So I would look for facts and statistics. I would also look for real world examples depending on the prompt. So either examples of whatever the topic is being successful or failing, because that's going to be more logical as well. So I found that when students like kind of over underline, meaning like they underline way too much or circle or star too much as they're approaching synthesis, it gets really confusing because then they go back to the source and they can't find the quote that they want. So I honestly think students should do it a little bit more sparingly. Or at least that's how I do it. I try to write at least one essay a year with my students as like a mock or like a timed thing. And I underline a lot more sparingly than I think people would expect. And it's because if I underline everything, then it's hard for me to keep track of my notes. So hopefully that helps. All right. So if you're just joining on either YouTube or TikTok, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe or follow if you aren't already. That really does help. I'm going to be going live each Sunday, probably around this time, but that I suppose could change until the exam because I want to help teachers and students prepare. All right, let's see. So I'm answering questions on both platforms. Let's see. For how do I know which side is easier to write about for a synthesis essay? Okay, that's a great question, especially if you don't know the topic, because they've had a few different topics in years past where like one was eminent domain, and I don't think most students knew what that was until they started reading the sources. So you don't really know which side you're on. Or it could be an issue that, as my students say, like, I don't really care about it, so I don't know which side to be on. In that case, I would consider two things. I would kind of make like a T chart if you can, or something. Like a T chart is like a two-sided chart, but you can do it in different ways, of like the different arguments in the sources, and figure out which side is more compelling, which side you have more evidence for, because they're not going to know who you are. At most, we see like an ID number and it's like 13 plus digits long. Like we have zero clue who you are. So we're not going to be like, oh, this person said this on their AP test. So even if you really don't agree with the argument you're making, but it's the best argument you can make at the time, go for it. One example of this that I did with my own students recently is our prompt was about like essentially like, should kindergarten be transformed into a more academic environment? And so I had them put on one side of their chart reasons why it should be, and then on the other side reasons why it shouldn't be. And what they would do is they would write like the reason. So like one of the reasons was like social and emotional development, and that was against it. Like we don't want to make it more academic because it was going to affect that type of development. So they put social and emotional development, and then they put the sources that related to it. So they put in parentheses like sources, I don't know, like A and E. And that way, once they made their T chart, we as a class had a lot more evidence on one side, or like reasons on one side than the other. So students kind of knew to go to that perspective because they could say a lot more about it. And since they had figured out which sources went with each possible reason, they had done a lot of their planning in advance. I really think planning your essays in advance quickly helps, because if you just kind of free write, you can, it's very easy to get off topic, and it's very easy to not earn some of those points on the rubric. So the other thing to consider about which side you should write for is know your audience. So most AP readers are high school teachers. They come from all over the country. Some of them are international. Some of the other AP readers teach at the college level. So they kind of teach like the equivalent class of AP Lang, but it's like freshman comp, or there's different names for it, college English 1 or whatever. So keep in mind that it's a teacher reading it. Now, we're not supposed to bring in our bias as a teacher or a reader. So I tell my students all the time, like, it doesn't matter if I agree with you. And honestly, a lot of the topics on the exam are not topics that I have strong opinions about anyway. But it just matters, like, is your argument convincing? So if you're not sure which side to go for, I would make some kind of chart and figure out which side you have the most evidence for and just go with that. Usually there's like a slight slant to the sources in some cases. So you'll have some that are in favor of the issue, or giving certain reasons for it, others against it. And then usually some of the sources are neutral as well. So they could kind of go either way. Let's see. In row B, discussing rhetorical choices to connect to the message. Are you required to discuss the audience to get full points? Okay, that's a great question. And actually, I think somebody asked this on one of my recent videos, and I need to respond to that comment as well. You're not required to, but I think it helps, because what they're looking for is for you to connect the choice to the rhetorical situation. And the rhetorical situation has like 5 to 6 components. So we've got, like, I use the acronym SPACE CAT. So the space part, speaker, purpose, audience, context, exigence, that's the rhetorical situation. You could also throw in argument and message into the rhetorical situation too. So I think students should try to analyze why the writer is making that choice for that audience on that occasion, but it's not technically required. But I do think it can help, especially if it's a speech or a letter. Some of the ones that have been a prompt from like a nonfiction text, like a book, those might be a little bit harder to connect to the audience. But usually for a speech or letter, the speaker's really trying to connect to the audience in some way. So they might be making a certain comparison because it resonates with the audience. So they might be repeating a certain word because that word and its meaning and its tone would impact the audience. So in that case, I think you should try to connect it to the audience if you can, but I don't think it has to be this huge task. I give my students some sentence frames. And so I'll try to remember a couple off the top of my head, but you could say something like, given that speaker is speaking to, and then who the audience is, he or she must do this. So I'll use Florence Kelly as an example because I use that passage all the time. If you're not familiar with the passage, Florence Kelly is this activist who's speaking to a group of suffragettes. So a group of women who wanted women's rights back in 1905. But she's talking to them about child labor, which is a related but separate subject. So you could say something like, given that she is speaking to a group of suffragettes in Pennsylvania, if you wanted to add that, she must connect her cause of child labor to the women's values of women's rights or something like that. Just kind of ad-libbing it here. But you don't have to necessarily make it this huge part of your essay, but I think there's like subtle ways to connect to the audience as well. And so I have some sentence frames that I give students to do that. All right. So yeah, feel free to ask questions. We're live both on TikTok and YouTube, and I'm going to be going live weekly. So I'm happy to answer any questions you have. We've been talking a little bit about synthesis and rhetorical analysis, but I'm happy to answer questions about argument and multiple choice as well. And if you're on TikTok, please hit the screen and get some likes in there, and ask whatever questions you have. And if you are looking for additional content, I have huge playlists on YouTube for each of the essays. I'm working on making playlists over on TikTok as well, but I need to get to 10K and I'm pretty close. I think I'm at like 9,000 followers. So once I am able to hit 10K, hopefully soon, I'll make playlists as there because I try to do really short content on TikTok and like the longer content on YouTube. Let's see. So, a couple questions. One was about the argument essay. That honestly is my least favorite of the three essays if I had to choose one. And I think the reason why I dislike it is because you have to rely on the information that you know. But there are some things that you can be doing now to prepare for the exam in ways that I think are like not super stressful. So, one thing to remember about the argument essay is that you need specific evidence. And so, you want to make sure that there are certain topics that you can write about well. Obviously, we don't know what the exam prompt will be, but usually they're pretty open ended. So if you can have 3 to 5 historical figures that you could write about, 3 to 5 historical events that you could write about, 3 to 5 current events, then hopefully you're building a database. So, what I tell my students to do is I tell them to, first of all, pay attention in history class because a lot of my students like to bring in evidence from history class. We have two fabulous history teachers. But also like just once a week, like look up a current event. Even as you're scrolling through TikTok, you can learn a little bit about current events, but make sure it's topics that you can speak about knowledgeably. So read an article, listen to a podcast, listen to a TED talk. It doesn't have to be this huge ordeal, but it can really help you prepare because I feel like the students who have that just general knowledge of like certain specific topics, it really does help their essays as well. All right, it looks like we have a few more just joining us, so feel free to ask questions in the chat. Let me see if I missed any. I always have trouble comprehending readings and putting my thoughts into words. What should I do? Okay, so it depends on if this is for multiple choice or rhetorical analysis. Um, for multiple choice, if we're talking about the reading comprehension questions, there's a couple things that I think can help. One would be um, taking a bullet point of like the main idea of each paragraph and just kind of making sure that you understand the paragraph as best you can before moving on, but don't get stuck. Sometimes if the passage is kind of confusing in the beginning, you just need to keep reading. I've had some students tell me that they try to go through a passage twice. So they'll read it kind of quickly one time. And then once they get the gist of what it's about, they'll go through and then they'll start annotating more. Not everyone does that though, because some people are maybe like they read a little bit more slowly or they process better if they do it differently. But it can help to just kind of keep like a main idea of like, okay, what is this paragraph actually saying? Just like a quick bullet point. But if it gets tricky, it's okay to move on because honestly, sometimes the passages make more sense as you go. One tip for the reading multiple choice that helps some of my students, not all of them, is to read the questions first. My students that struggle with pacing or my students that just in general do not like reading comprehension, I have found that they often do better if they read the questions first, not the answer choices, just the question, and then go to the passage. I've also had some students be like, that screws me up. I don't like that approach. So it's something that I would try out if you have access to like one of the free SAT or ACT tests that are offered online. Try it out with that. Definitely don't just do that for an in-class assignment that's important or like on test day. But for some students, it really does help. Now, if we're talking about comprehension for rhetorical analysis, I would say one of the things that can help is just kind of um, figuring out what the message, argument, or purpose is as you read, and don't necessarily try to take notes on every single rhetorical choice that you see because sometimes, for instance, the writer might ask a rhetorical question, but you might not have a whole lot to say about that. So if you put like rhetorical question in your annotations, but you're not going to write about it, sometimes it like just slows you down and it kind of like makes your notes kind of harder to read and stuff like that. So I think sometimes it can be helpful to think like big picture, like what are they doing in the beginning, middle, and end, and not worrying about like every tiny rhetorical choice that you see. because sometimes students kind of zero in on something really small and they miss some of like the bigger stuff that's going on. So that might be part of it. Let's see. As a follow-up, the last time I did a time prompt, I scored a 2 out of 4 on row B because in the thesis and commentary, I didn't connect to purpose, or sorry, I didn't connect purpose to a specific audience and just said the reader. What do you think? I'll always try to mention who the specific audience is, and same for the writer. It's kind of, I guess, just like, I don't want to say a pet peeve, but like, if I see that students say like the audience or the writer, it feels like really impersonal. Like it feels like you're not actually talking about the prompt or the passage that you're supposed to be talking about. Now, I could see it happening like one time. Like if you've already said who the audience is a bunch of times and you want to just say the audience, that makes sense, especially if it's like a larger audience. Like if it's like a president speaking to the American public, instead of saying the American public or the American people or Americans, I could see like maybe once in the essay saying the audience. But you want to use the specifics that you have as much as you can. And obviously you need the commentary and stuff as well. But remember, you want to assume that the person reading your essay, yes, they understand the passage and they've read the passage, but they're looking for your analysis. So if you use really vague terms like the speaker, the writer, or if you just say to achieve their purpose and you don't tell us what the purpose is, then it doesn't show that you understood the task or the prompt. So I would always try to be as specific as you can. All right, let me see if there's any questions on TikTok. I see a couple more on YouTube. For the synthesis essay, what type of evidence should I be looking for, and are some more convincing than others? Oh, okay, so for synthesis, look for facts and statistics because those are usually very logical and usually they're somewhat easy to integrate into your essay. Also look for real world examples, depending on like the topic, examples of success or failure, things like that. Also expert testimony. So it doesn't have to necessarily be the person who wrote the source, but sometimes if it's like an article, they'll quote somebody. So if the topic has to do with like, I don't know, like education, because they've been pulling a lot of like education prompts lately. Then like if they quote like if the prompt is about kindergarten and they quote a kindergarten teacher, then you can potentially look for that because they're trying to add credibility to their article. And so that's a way for you to add credibility to your essay as well. So usually synthesis essays are supposed to be like factual and logical. I have seen students kind of in their conclusion try to create their own emotional appeal, but that's kind of tricky sometimes. So it's an argument with sources. So try to be very like factual, look for data, statistics, expert testimony, real world examples, things like that. And you can, in a synthesis essay, incorporate personal experience. Just make sure that it's relevant and meaningful. I've seen students do it very well. I've seen students try it and it kind of flopped. So that's something to think about as well, is like some topics you might have a personal connection with. Just avoid hypotheticals. So avoid stuff like imagine a student who does this, or suppose a student does this, because those are not very convincing. They're very general. So keep it in like real world examples, not hypotheticals. I often run out of time when writing my argumentative essays. How do you recommend I prevent that? Okay, so that's a great question. I feel like students run out of time regardless of which essay, but you're asking specifically about argument. The tips I have kind of go for all three essays though. First, I would say make a plan. It does not have to take you very long. I have my students kind of sometimes like write a tentative thesis, not like the whole thesis, but like I'll have them kind of put like a paraphrase or like a few keywords of their argument so they know like this is what I'm trying to prove. I like them to kind of outline their main ideas, and it's usually really simple. So for argument, let me use the disobedience prompt because that's the first one that comes to mind. So if we're talking about the value of disobedience, they might say like on their notes, like valuable because progress. Like it doesn't even have to be a complete thought. And so then we could talk about like the main ideas, like it leads to reform. And so main idea, reform, and then they could put like their specific evidence there. And it doesn't have to be super detailed in the outline, but I think that helps because if they're running out of time, they have a plan, they know what to follow. And that way they're not halfway through their essay wondering like, okay, what do I want to write about next? Because I have seen students do that. If they don't make a tentative outline, they get like one body paragraph done and they're like, okay, what do I do next? So have a tentative plan, but it does not have to be super detailed for a timed essay. The other thing is it kind of depends on where you are like wasting your time. So are you spending too long planning? Are you spending too long on your intro? Are you spending too long on a body paragraph? You, for all three essays, technically on the exam, just need a really short intro. Worst case scenario, you just write a thesis. Ideally, you'll have a couple sentences before that thesis if you can, because if it's just a thesis, it feels really jarring. It's kind of like, boom, here's my essay. But technically, like the only point you really get from your intro is your thesis point. So if you are spending a lot of time on an intro, like I've seen kids write like half a page of their intro, you're like, I read it and I'm like, okay, you got the thesis point. You could have cut half of this. Just my opinion. And obviously there might be exceptions to that, but figure out where you are like wasting time. Is it the planning? Is it the intro? Because you can cut the intro down really easily. Is it the body paragraphs? If so, I would say it kind of depends on like what the issue is. Are you still writing a really strong body paragraph? Because I've seen a lot of students have like one super good body paragraph that elevates their score, and then they get like halfway through the second, and it kind of falls off the track, so to speak. So depending on the essay and the quality of the execution, that one paragraph could be enough to get you that 130. But if you're aiming for like a 140, then we need two consistent body paragraphs. So what I like to do is I like to have students practice with time constraints, and you don't have to do a full essay. I'll have students write a paragraph and I'll say, you have to write me a full body paragraph in 20 minutes. And then the next time for a different essay, it might be 17, it might be 15, that kind of thing. So you can do that kind of stuff at home too. I know not everybody likes to study or practice at home, but kind of figure out where you're wasting time and practice writing quickly, like set timers for yourself and things like that. Also, don't waste time on, I hate saying this as an English teacher, but don't waste time on like spelling and grammar. Like if we can read it, like it's fine. I know they say there's like a bullet point on the rubric about like, or not the rubric, but the cover page about like, make sure your essay has like good punctuation or whatever they say. But like, yeah, you can have a comma splice. You can misspell a word. I had a student a few years ago who I think maybe had dyslexia undiagnosed, but like spelt everything phonetically. That student still made a very high score on the exam because even though things were not spelled correctly, I still knew what they were trying to say. Like it was still obvious what it was. So like don't stress about like proofreading. If you are going to go back and revise, focus on content, not so much the grammar, unless it's like a really quick glaring mistake that you could fix. So that's how I would recommend like preventing running out of time, is just figuring out where you are losing your time and kind of restructuring that on the exam, at least for the paper test. Cause I know some people are taking it digitally, and I haven't really looked into the digital test yet, cause I think they offered it digitally a couple years ago and it's different now. So I'm really only talking about the paper test here, but you on exam day can answer the essays. So synthesis, rhetorical analysis, argument in any order that you want. Most people start with synthesis because it's the most time consuming. But if you're better at argument, you can do it question 1, question 3, question 2, if you wanted to. So you can play to your strengths in that way. Because what's going to happen is at the top of your page, there's going to be like these 3 little dots. It's going to say like question 1, you bubble in question 1 if that's the one you're answering. So when readers read it, for us, at least now, it comes up on our computer. Somebody has to like scan in all these essays. And so if it's bubbled in as Q2, it tells the computer that. And like what happens is we see question 2 and like we scroll through. And then like if we can't find it, we have access to your whole packet to like look for it. And if we see no essay at all, before we can give it like a 0 or a no response, it's probably a no response, but we have to have like our table leader check it. So like just FYI, like if you write stuff in a different order than what the exam order is, we can figure that out super easily. So I don't know if anyone's shared that info before, but you can technically play to your strengths in that way. And in the same regard, like you don't have to spend 40 minutes on an essay. You have a concrete amount of time on the exam. You have 2 hours and 15 minutes. So they're going to tell you your recommended reading period has begun, and that's 15 minutes. A lot of students spend that time on synthesis. I tell my own students, maybe cut it down to 10 minutes because a lot of my students want extra time on rhetorical analysis. So you have this 2 hours and 15 minutes, and they're supposed to cue you at different points. But you can spend 5 fewer minutes on something, 5 extra minutes on something, whatever you want to do on the test. You just can't go from like the essays to multiple choice or something. Like the multiple choice is done and then the essays are done and they're totally separate. Yeah, so feel free to ask more questions. I'm happy to stay on for a little bit longer. And if you're just joining, I will be doing these lives weekly. I'm going to try to keep it to like this time slot as long as my schedule permits, just to answer student questions on TikTok and YouTube about the exam. So if you have questions, feel free to add that in the chat. And then also if you're watching on TikTok, please tap your screen a couple times to give it a like. That helps push it out to other students as well. So yeah, we've been talking about mostly the essays today, synthesis, rhetorical analysis, and argument, but I'm happy to answer multiple choice questions as well. I am working on a video about like how to pass the exam, like an updated one, but I just did a TikTok and I pinned it, I think, about how to know what your mock exam score would be. Because a lot of times students want to know, like, am I on track for a 3 or a 4 or a 5, or like, how do I earn that? So that's something worth talking about, I think. So first of all, if you're trying to shoot for a composite of a 3, so your composite score is going to be a number between 1 and 5. And that's unfortunately the only info you get from the College Board in July. It'll say like AP Lang, and it'll say a number 1 through 5. You don't get to find out how many multiple choice you got right, what your essay scores were. I know a lot of times students want to know that, but unfortunately all you get is this number, and that's the number that you can send to colleges. And if you're shooting for a 3, at this point in the year, I would say you want to try to get 23 out of 45 multiple choice questions correct. Sometimes it might be a couple fewer, sometimes it might be a couple more, but we want a little bit more than 50% on our multiple choice, which is hopefully a relief, because a lot of times with tests, we're trying to get 100. You're not necessarily trying to get 100 with these standardized tests. So you want to be trying to get like 55%, and then a 4 out of 6 on your essays, if you can. That would probably get you like a comfortable 3. But I have like a pinned video on TikTok that if you watch the whole thing, it explains like how to plug in your exact numbers and figure out what your score would be. And there's online calculators as well that I've tried, and they seem pretty accurate. And I'm working on a YouTube video for this as well. But I do a mock exam with my students. We started it before break, and then they finish it in January, February, because we break it up into 2 parts. And that way I can tell them when that mock exam is over, like, okay, here's your strengths, your weaknesses, here's what we got to work on. So if you're trying to figure out like how to earn a certain score, there is a way to calculate that. Is there a website or database where we can find old student responses that scored high? Yes, there is. On the College Board website, I usually just Google it. So if you know the specific prompt that you are looking for, let's say you want 2021, type in like AP Lang 2021 Q1 student responses. And if it's a somewhat recent prompt, there's going to be like 2 documents that you're going to need, because the responses are going to be in one. And it's not just going to be high scoring, but the high scoring ones are first. They do it like high to low. They're going to give you samples. And then they put the actual scores and the scoring commentary in a separate document. So you're going to need the student samples and you're going to need the scoring commentary. So if you're looking for a certain prompt, you can just Google it. But if you type in like AP Lang past exam prompts, there is a page on the College Board website that has them by year, and you can click on it, and it's public access. So I'm not like sharing any secrets or anything. Those essays are out there. So that's something I use as a tool for my students, as well as I have them look at some sample essays. Usually I have them look at like the essays that score a 120 and a 130, because that's kind of like the make it or break it point on the rubric. We'll also look at like the difference between a 1.3 and a 1.40. And sometimes we'll look at the sophistication point. I feel like it's nice to see essays that have earned that, but I also don't want students stressing out about the sophistication points. But what they do is, yeah, they have like multiple from each year. So each of the 3 essays, they're going to put samples out there. And then there's usually like anywhere from 6 to 8 samples because there's a range of scores that they show. So there's definitely usually like a perfect score. Sometimes they have 2 perfect scores, and like other higher level ones as well. And then they also have the ones that like samples of ones that are kind of low. So you can see. If you're looking at an older prompt, let's say from like, I don't know, like 2015, and it's on the 9-point rubric, you can, I would say if you're trying to get a 4 out of 6, look at an essay that scores like a 5 or a 6 out of 9 if it's the 9-point rubric. Usually for those, they didn't give out as many samples, so they would give out like a high, a middle, and a low. And like a 9 out of 9 probably would be a 6 out of 6, but like an 8 out of 9 could be a 5, it could be a 6. There's not like a direct conversion, but if it's an old prompt, they still have samples. There's just not as many of them, but yeah, you can see them. Let's see. I've been getting mostly 4 out of 6 on my essays. Any advice to get to a 5 or maybe even a 6? Okay, so that's a great question. Here's the thing about like all 3 FRQs is that if you're getting a 4 out of 6, first of all, congrats, because that's a solid score, especially at this point in the year. Usually the difference between an essay that scores a 4 out of 6 and a 5 out of 6 is the consistency. So without having seen your essays, chances are you might have one paragraph that's really good, one body paragraph, but maybe the other one is a little bit iffy. And so because of that, what you want to do is work on your consistency. So it's possible that one paragraph's strong and that the other paragraph is not elevating your score. Because the biggest difference, I think, from a 3 and a 4 in evidence and commentary is the consistency of proving your claims. And it also kind of depends on which essay we're talking about as well. But what you could do is look at like a previous essay that you've written and get some highlighters out, or if it's digital, you can highlight digitally and highlight your evidence in one color and your commentary in another. And if your essay has even analysis, you should see almost like stripes on your page. Like, you know, like if let's say it's green and pink, those are your highlighter colors. You should see a little bit of green for your evidence and a lot of pink, a little bit of green, a lot of pink. So you want to make sure that you have plenty of commentary. You also want to make sure that you don't have what we call limited commentary. So limited commentary is kind of like simplistic. It's kind of like it's an attempt, but it's kind of empty. So for rhetorical analysis, limited commentary is sometimes these like pre-packaged expressions. So it could be things like opens the reader's eyes and, you know, like, or pulls on the reader's heartstrings or something like that. So we always want to be more specific in our commentary there. So if you're getting a 4 out of 6 on your essays, that would be my advice is try to figure out which claim or claims need more consistency and more commentary. But if you're curious about rhetorical analysis specifically, I have a video that I just put up on YouTube about the rhetorical analysis rubric, and it kind of breaks everything down, including sophistication. And I have some older videos as well. So that might help. It is a longer video though. How do I work on the flow of my essays? Okay, that's a great question. I think as far as like writing style, there's some tips that I think might help. First of all, make sure that you are varying your syntax. So syntax is sentence structure. You want to make sure that you are not having all the sentences be the same structure, because then it's really choppy. One way to potentially see if this is happening is to read your essay out loud, or like look at the types of sentences that you have. Because if you have a lot of sentences that start with like the same word, or it's just all kind of like subject verb at the beginning of the sentence, it's probably a little bit choppy. So add in like an introductory clause, a transition word, something like that. So look at your syntax, because you want to try to have more advanced sentence structure throughout your essay as you can. It doesn't mean that every sentence has to be a complex or compound sentence or anything like that, because sometimes you do need a simple sentence. But make sure that your sentences, as far as the structure, it's varied. The next thing I would do is look for opportunities to increase your word choice. So possibly by adding in adjectives and adverbs that can help with the precision of your language. Also try to eliminate lower level words from your writing. A lot of ones that we see are like a lot, good, bad things, stuff. Try to elevate those words and just use a more appropriate synonym. That would be something that could help. So varying your syntax, adding in adjectives and adverbs to make your writing more precise, and just specifics in general, especially for rhetorical analysis. Don't just say the message or the purpose. Tell us what it is. Don't just say the writer or the reader. Like, tell us who the speaker or the audience is, things like that. But those are some things that can help. Something else that can help, and it's related to syntax, is learning how to incorporate advanced punctuation appropriately. So semicolons, colons, dashes, and also commas for like non-essential phrasing. I have videos out. I think I did semicolons and colons already pretty recently on my channel. And I'm working on others. If you need like a little refresher on how to do that, don't overdo it though. So don't try to put like a colon and a dash and a semicolon in every single paragraph. But if you can use a colon correctly, it really helps. And dashes as well. So changing up your sentence structure and using that advanced punctuation can help with the flow. So yeah, hopefully that helps. And like definitely check out those like grammar videos that I uploaded pretty recently if you need like more tips. All right. Yes, I'm glad that helped. Feel free to, if you're watching over on TikTok and you find this helpful, tap your screen to give this live some more likes, and feel free to ask your questions in the chat. I'm happy to stay on for a little while longer to answer any questions you have about AP Lang in general or the exam, writing, that kind of stuff. And like I said before, I'll be going live weekly. So if you are just tuning in and you're like, oh, I don't have a question yet, just know that there will be future lives. I also try to respond on TikTok and YouTube to questions as best I can. So if you have a question there on TikTok, I sometimes try to do like a video reply. And obviously YouTube, I can't necessarily do that, but I can at least comment back if you have questions. And if you are not following on both platforms, it would mean a lot to me if you would consider following and subscribing, because I'm really close to 10K on both platforms. And especially with TikTok, once I get to 10K, I have the opportunity to like do more for students. Like I can make playlists and things like that. So I'm trying to increase my subscribers there, not for like selfish reasons, but so that I can help out better. So yeah. All right. Any other questions about anything? We've talked about a lot. We've talked about synthesis. We've talked about rhetorical analysis and argument. Haven't really talked about multiple choice as much. I feel like that's probably like the harder one to teach in some sense. But just know that multiple choice is 45% of your exam score. So your composite. And so since there are 45 questions, each question is 1 point. So if you're the type of person who is leaving questions blank on multiple choice, don't do that. Even if it's a guess, you should answer every question. If you are running out of time, pick a letter and bubble that letter straight down. So let's say you have like time's about to be called and you have 10 questions left, pick a letter like A or D or whatever, and just bubble that. Don't try to make a pattern, because apparently statistically you're better off just picking one letter. The multiple choice, a lot of my students say that the writing questions are easier, which are at the end of the test. So you, on the paper test, you don't have to take the questions in order, meaning like if you want to skip to passage 3 and just start there, technically you can. Just make sure you're matching it up on your bubble sheet. But knowing that each question is worth 1 point is somewhat helpful, because you don't want to spend too long on a multiple choice question and maybe you get it right, maybe you don't, and then like potentially shortchange yourself time that you could have spent on other potentially easier questions at the end of the test. So answer all multiple choice questions, but like don't linger too long on any one particular question, because they're all worth 1 point. Now your essays are worth 55% of your composite score. And honestly, the thesis point is super easy to earn, in my opinion, and it should be pretty easy to get a 1-2-0 as long as you have a body paragraph that has a claim and some evidence and commentary. So really, we want to be pushing ourselves to try to get those 1-3-0 or a 4 out of 6. The one thing that I find a little bit frustrating about the way the rubric is, is that there's a range of essays that can fall in each score. In my classroom, I actually give half points sometimes because I can see that a student's improving, but they might not have gotten to the next level yet. So that's, I think, one of the frustrating parts about the essay rubric is that you could improve, but it like in one way, but it might not totally improve your score. So if that's the case, just keep going, keep trying, and really working on that consistency with your commentary. And at this point in the year, I really don't recommend that students focus on sophistication too much, but I do start talking to my students about it. And we talk about like what it looks like, because what I've found in the past is that if students are able to understand what sophistication could be, then it helps their commentary, even if they don't get the sophistication point. So I'm happy to answer questions about that as well. We'll stay on for like maybe 5 or 10 more minutes. So if you have questions either on TikTok or on YouTube, go ahead and ask them in the chat and I'd be happy to talk about it. And if you haven't checked out my playlist and videos on YouTube, I have lots of stuff planned already, but I also have almost 4 years worth of content over there. So chances are a lot of the topics that you might have questions about, I have videos on as well. Definitely working on some new stuff for the coming year though. All right. Let's see if I missed any questions over on YouTube. I think I answered all those and I think I got everything on TikTok. Thank you for sharing the live. That's really helpful. So for, let's see, multiple choice. I've heard of multiple approaches to reading the passages. So read the passage first, carefully read the questions. Skim the passage first. What do you think is best for time? Okay, that's a great question. Honestly, it depends on your style. I would try the different approaches and see what works for you. Try to, I would use like an SAT passage because there used to be, I think 10. I think they took a couple of them offline, but there's SAT practice tests online, and not every question is going to be like the AP Lang test, but they're close. So if you're looking for practice materials to kind of experiment on, I would use the SAT. Specifically the nonfiction passages though, because you're not going to encounter fiction on the AP Lang exam. I have students who like to read the passage first and they kind of read and annotate and then they go to the questions. I have other students who like to go to the questions first, not looking at the answer choices, just reading the questions, and they will like literally bracket stuff off. So if it says like, what is the main idea or function of the first paragraph, they'll like bracket it off and put like question 1. And that helps them for my students who tend to either struggle with pacing or get like easily distracted, their words, not mine. Then that method helps because they're focused, because like you're not reading to be entertained. Like in a lot of cases, these passages are kind of boring, if I'm being honest. So you are literally reading to comprehend and answer questions. And because it's a test, you're probably having like, your heart's racing and like you're stressing out. So if reading the questions first so you know what you're looking for and like bracketing stuff off if that helps you, go for it. If you're the type of person that likes to read it all first very thoroughly and annotate and then go to the questions, that's fine. Because for some students, that really does help. If they read it thoroughly and more slowly, then they don't have to go back to the passage as much. I'm the type of person that I wish someone had told me in high school it's okay to look at the questions and then go to the passage, because I was always told read the passage, then the questions. And then I would like second guess myself because I'm like, did I really remember that? Or like, I don't know. So find the approach that works for you, because I don't think there's a one approach that's going to fit for everybody. So that I encourage my students to practice and experiment. And so what we do is, because my students take the ACT, so I use some ACT tests which are also good. And I use some SAT materials, is I will time them for a certain amount of time. I usually give them more time than I think they'll need, or like more than exam pace. And then as they do it more, we cut back. But I might tell them like, hey, today I want you to try this approach, see how it is. And then the next week I might give them a very similar passage and I might tell them to try a different approach. And once they figure out their methodology, that's where I step back as a teacher and I'm like, it's your test. You do what you need to do. So I would just say, if you're struggling with multiple choice, like try the different passages on your own. Keep as many variables the same as you can. So try to choose the same type of passage, same number of questions, and just see which method works for you. I wouldn't like change up your method on test day. I would have your method like set before test day. The other thing is that the writing questions, so like the ones that are kind of like editing, those passages are shorter, there are fewer questions, and so it takes students less time in most cases. So I think what sometimes is a little bit confusing to students is there's 45 questions, there's 2 longer passages and 3 shorter ones. So I think sometimes students think they need to have an even split, like 30 minutes and 30 minutes. And for my students that take the whole hour, that's usually not the case. Usually they spend like 35 on reading and like 25 on the writing. And like I said before, I have some students that just like to go straight to the writing multiple choice because that's where they're really strong and they want to like spend the time on that and earn as many questions, like as many points as they can. And then they go to the reading comprehension. How do you effectively annotate passages? I would say look for like the main ideas. If you are like, I wouldn't necessarily worry about like if a word is confusing, trying to figure out the meaning of the word unless there's a question about it. But I would say more of like annotating like the main idea of the paragraph, that kind of thing. If you are looking at the questions first, then it's a little bit easier to know what types of things you're looking for. So like my students who read the questions first, let's say it says like what is the writer doing or what is the choice in paragraph 3, they'll put like a bracket around paragraph 3 and then they'll put choice. And then as they actually go to read that, then they're like, oh, repetition or whatever it is. So, because I think sometimes it's possible to like over annotate and possibly annotate stuff that you don't really need. So I tend to keep my annotations kind of like not sparse, but like when I'm annotating for a standardized test versus like an essay that I'm going to write or something, I tend to do more annotations for like the essays and stuff. So focus on like the main idea. If it's a really old passage and it's not broken up into like clear paragraphs, because sometimes really old passages, it's just like a wall of text, kind of create like almost like create your own paragraphs. Like it's okay to pause after a sentence or two and just kind of figure out, okay, this is what they're saying. There also, it's going to sound super obvious, but like read the information that's provided above the passage, because sometimes they'll tell you like this is an excerpt from a speech by so and so in this year, and or they might tell you this is a speech about this topic. Read the provided info, and that goes for synthesis as well. But for multiple choice, like I've had students like not read the little sentence above the passage, and then like they found the passage really confusing, whereas if you had just read the sentence, then it gives you a lot more helpful info. And also try to figure out what the topic is about. Like there's been some passages that maybe the first paragraph's kind of confusing. So like figure out the main idea and possibly try to be thinking about things like tone and stuff like that as you read. Because if you don't know what the passage is about, and I mean at the most basic level, like what are they talking about? It makes it really hard to understand the passage. So at the very least, if you're confused as you start approaching it, ask yourself, okay, what is the main idea or the topic here? And kind of start there. And then you can start to think about like, how does the writer feel about this topic and things like that. All right. Any more questions? Feel free to post them in the chat, either on YouTube or on TikTok. And I'm happy to stay on just a few more minutes to answer maybe 1 or 2 more questions. I will be back live around this time next week. If you have additional questions, and also on TikTok and YouTube, I have several videos. My goal is to post 1 YouTube video a week, and like right now I'm trying for 2 TikToks a day. So if you're interacting on TikTok, I would really mean a lot to me if you would follow and like those as well. How do you practice for multiple choice? Okay, so here's my methods for students who don't have access to AP Classroom, because if your teacher assigns stuff on AP Classroom, I think most of that stuff can be useful. And I don't assign a ton on AP Classroom, but I do use some of their resources. There is something called an AP Lang course exam description, and they have some sample questions. There's like 1 reading passage and 1 writing passage, and it's this huge document. It's really for teachers. But if you scroll down to like page 120, there's some sample questions. Those can be really good. I did a TikTok about it recently, showing students how to access it. If you don't want to go through that huge PDF just to find 17 questions, I would say start with SAT, and type in like SAT practice test, and you want to choose the ones from the College Board. It's called the SAT, I think it says like SUITE, like SUITE. I would start with test one because like the tests are all kind of equal. So just for your own like record keeping and sanity purposes, start with test one. Some of the tests they've pulled. So if you like have trouble finding like one, I forgot which ones they pulled, but if you can't find like test two or something like that, it's okay to skip to three. But I would look at for the reading multiple choice, the passages on the SAT, not the first one, because the first one's usually fiction. I would look at the remaining passages, the latter ones for that. And don't necessarily stress on the SAT about the questions that ask about evidence, because if you're trying to prepare for the AP Lang test, we don't have on the AP Lang test questions about like, why is this the best, like what is the best evidence for the answer to question two or something like that. So also on the AP Lang test, you're not going to have like a graph like you might on the SAT. You will possibly have the graph on synthesis. So if you want to practice a multiple choice question to make sure you know how to interpret graphs, that's fine. But to the best of my knowledge, they have not put a graph on the AP Lang reading. So that's where I would start is if you're trying to do reading comprehension and you need to practice for AP Lang, go to some of the free SAT tests. I would use the College Board ones, not ones from other test prep companies to start with, and look at the nonfiction passages there. And if you're also studying for the SAT, this is like double dipping and it's a great way to practice. If you are wanting to focus on the writing multiple choice, then on the SAT, you're going to go to the writing and language test. Don't worry about the questions where it's just like commas and dashes and subject verb agreement. Look at the questions that have a question stem, meaning like there's a question above it. Like it might say, the writer wants to add the following sentence to paragraph 3. Should they do so? Or something like the writer wants to create the best transition from this paragraph to the subsequent paragraph, whatever it is. Look for questions like that where there's actually a question and then answer choices, because those are going to be most similar to the AP Lang writing and language. And so that's where I tell my students to start, because I tutor some students in addition to having my own class at my school. And so if they're looking for outside resources, SAT works well. Marco Learning has a free practice test. I think you just have to enter your email. And their questions are pretty solid. Like it's set up like the AP Lang test. So it's not official, but it's pretty close. I'm trying to think of any other test prep companies that I know have a free one. I don't necessarily recommend students go out there and buy the test prep books though, because I've seen some that are like almost like the questions are harder than the real exam, or like they're a little slightly inaccurate and it like throws students off. So those are the resources that I would start with if you're looking for multiple choice. For sure. So SAT release tests, and then also Marco Learning has a good free one. And then like once you kind of know ballpark how you're scoring on your multiple choice and your essays, then you can start to kind of predict your score and kind of see like, oh, if I answer maybe 5 more questions right, will it impact my score? Things like that. There are like 2 free score calculators that I know of online, and they're pretty accurate. And then I just posted, I think it's a pinned video on TikTok about how to calculate your mock score if you're trying to figure out like, am I at a 3 composite or a 4 or something like that? Because some students like to know that info. All right. How do I practice the timed writing for the AP test? Okay, so are you talking about like on your own? If you're talking about like on your own, there's a couple things to think about. With my own students, I have them start with writing, like we write a thesis statement and I time them, and then we write body paragraphs, and we build to a full essay. So if you feel like you're ready for a full essay, then go for it. I would choose a prompt that you haven't seen before. I would set a timer for, it depends on which essay we're talking about. For synthesis, I would give yourself up to 55 minutes. For rhetorical analysis, I would say 40 to 45 minutes. And argument, like maybe 35 to 40 minutes, depending on what you're looking for. And then what I would do is I would time myself for that amount of time, see how it goes. And then if there are student samples of that prompt online, compare your work to their work kind of thing. Because a lot of the recent prompts, they have some really good student samples for. But if you don't feel like you're ready to do a full essay and time yourself yet, time yourself for just a paragraph. time yourself for like 15 to 20 minutes and just see if you can write like the best possible paragraph in that amount of time. Because having one really strong body paragraph can put you in potential scoring range for a 130 or a 4 out of 6. And I honestly think it's helpful for students to fix things at like the paragraph level first before the essay level, if that makes sense. So that would be something I would say. And then honestly, with my own students, as we get closer to the exam, so usually March or April, I have them write what I call like a double essay, meaning I will give them, it's usually like rhetorical analysis and argument. So I usually give them 80 to 85 minutes. We have a study session because my classes are only 45 minutes long, but I will have them practice writing 2 essays back to back that they have not seen before, because that's kind of mimicking the exam. So at this point in the year, I would focus on like writing really solid paragraphs and timing yourself, or just one essay. But in the next few months, maybe try to do 2 essays, because not gonna lie, on exam day, your hand is going to hurt from writing that much. You're probably gonna be stressing out. You're probably not gonna be able to think straight for a second as you read the prompt. So like, it's good to kind of practice that. My students have told me that with all the little timing things that we do, like I give them like 5 minutes to write an intro or 3 minutes to write a thesis or whatever it is. They're like, by the time the exam comes around, we're so used to being like timed that they're like, yeah, we know what pace we need to work at. So that's something that my students have said that I do that helps them. So hopefully that helps you guys as well. But yeah, I would focus on like whichever essay you're working on in class. If you are in class and you want to do, I would start with that. If your teacher hasn't given you a timed essay yet, but you want to do one on your own, start there. If you're self-studying for the exam, that might change what my recommendation is. How many essays do we have to write on the exam? 3. You get 2 hours and 15 minutes for the 3 essays. In your exam booklet, they're going to be in the order of synthesis, which is the one with sources, rhetorical analysis, which is the passage, usually a speech or a letter, but it's going to be some kind of nonfiction passage, and then argument, which is usually just like a quote. Sometimes there's no quote, and a prompt. You don't have to read anything. So the way the College Board recommends that you break it down is 15 minutes to read and then 40 minutes for each of the essays. Most of my students spend about 10 minutes reading, and then they do a 40-minute synthesis essay, and then they spend like 5 to 10 minutes reading for rhetorical analysis and planning, and then they write that essay, and then whatever time is left, they have for argument. So you're going to be cued. They're going to tell you like your 15 minutes of recommended reading time has begun. And then after that, they tell you you're advised to move on to your first essay. Then 40 minutes later, your second essay, but you technically can kind of parcel out the time however you want to. You also, on the paper test, do not have to answer the questions in order. So if you are really good at like synthesis and argument, and for whatever reason, rhetorical analysis is not your strong suit, and you want to write them question 1, question 3, question 2, that's okay. There's going to be a little thing at the top of your page that has like, it used to be a box. Now it's like bubbles. So it'll say like Q1, Q2, Q3, and you bubble in which essay you're writing on each of the pages for that essay. So yeah, that's the essay part. And then you get 1 hour for multiple choice. That's first. And they're separate sections. There's a break in between. So you're not allowed to go from like multiple choice to essays. Like there's literally like separate booklets. They're like shrink wrapped and everything. If you've never taken an AP test, there's like stickers involved. Like it's a process. So yeah, but you should get like, I think it's a 10-minute break on exam day in between sections. Usually at our school, like kids use the restroom and like if they need to, and like the person in charge of our AP test usually gives them like these teeny tiny bottles of water and like a snack, and they have to like not talk about the test, and there's all these rules. But yeah, you get 2 hours and 15 minutes for the essays. And there are 3 of them. And most students have their preferences too. So on exam day, I would play to your strengths. I have a video from last year about creating a game plan. And I will talk more about this as the exam gets closer. But like on exam day, it's literally about trying to score as many points as possible. So you want to play to your strengths however you can. So yeah. All right. So any other questions, feel free to type them in the chat. If you're just joining and you haven't heard me say this, I will be going live on YouTube and TikTok around this time every Sunday between now and the exam to help answer teacher and student questions. So feel free to ask questions here, or feel free to comment on my TikTok videos or YouTube videos. On TikTok, I try to respond with like a video response as well. And I'm really close to 10K on both platforms. So if you're not following and you're taking the AP Lang exam and you'd like some extra tips, like please either subscribe or follow. That would really help. And if you're watching live on TikTok, if you wouldn't mind just like tapping your screen a couple times to give me a few more likes, that would be greatly appreciated. But if you have any more questions, I would be happy to answer them. Otherwise, if there's no more questions, I'll be doing this next week as well. So I'm going to try to do it. I'm on Central Time. So like around 3 p.m. Eastern each week. And I will, thank you for the likes. I will basically answer whatever questions people have. And if there aren't questions, I'll just kind of talk about like the exam and stuff. So if you have questions, I'll stick around for just a few more minutes to answer them because we just had a few more people join. But basically, we've been talking about pretty much like the whole test. We've been talking about synthesis, rhetorical analysis, arguments, a little bit about multiple choice. So any questions you have, I'm happy to answer. I think right now, like one of the questions that a lot of students ask is like, how can I be preparing? So we just talked about like timed writing. If you haven't done a lot of timed writes in your class and you want to do that on the side at home, you can. I would say one of the best ways to prepare is if you're studying for the SAT or the ACT anyway, because I know there's some testing dates coming up in the next few months. That can help you with AP Lang multiple choice. Not all the questions are the same, but there is overlap. So if you're studying for the SAT or the ACT, by default, you're also sort of studying for AP Lang. So that's a bonus. Something else that you can do if you're trying to prepare is start to incorporate like just general knowledge into your daily life. So maybe once or twice a week, read an article, stay up to date with current events, start with topics you're interested in. If you're in history class, really pay attention to the historical figures and the historical movements, because you can usually use those in the argument essay as well. I encourage my students to like listen to one podcast, TED Talk, or like watch a documentary each week. So like literally like my students get to watch Netflix as part of, like, I don't assign much homework, but each week last semester they had to watch like a TED Talk, a documentary, or like some kind of podcast that interested them, because you never know what the exam prompt is going to be. So you want to try to have some just general background knowledge of topics you can write about specifically. So that usually really helps. So those are things you can be doing to prepare now. And then I have videos on YouTube all about the different topics. And I'm working on new content as well. And I have playlists over there. Once I hit 10K on TikTok, I'll start making playlists. So if you're looking for shorter content, TikTok is where I have all my quick tips. And then if you're looking for like longer content where it's like with examples and deeper explanations, that's like kind of what YouTube is for. Okay. All right, so I don't see any questions yet on, or any more questions on TikTok or YouTube. So I'm going to end this week's live, but I will be back next week. Thank you so much for joining, and I hope to see you all next week. I'll be going live until once a week until May. So feel free to ask any questions that you have. Happy New Year, everybody, and I hope you have a great day.